Hello, I'm Panos Kotzafanasis, and this is ASEAN Movie Pulse interviews. Today I'm here with Victor Fan, reader in film and media philosophy in the Department of Film Studies, King's College London. How are you, Victor?
I'm very fine, Pano. It's always great to have a chat with you.
Okay,
Yeah.
you too, my friend, you too.
Mhm.
So the initial point of this interview is that a couple of months ago in Asian Movie Pass, we decided to do a tribute to Chinese mainland cinema, mostly fourth, fifth, and sixth generation of filmmakers. And you were the one that suggested a list of movies. So first question is about that. When you were considering which movies you would suggest, what were your criteria, let's say?
My criteria are pretty, on the one hand, I sometimes would like to say part of it is very subjective because many of these films are films that personally I find are extremely important. But at the same time, I also say that it's not that subjective because I think, indeed, many of these films are must say. I really do think that they are must say, for each generation or for each particular period of time. I am, of course, not claiming that they are comprehensive, but at the same time, I think in order to, and also I also don't like the idea of like suggesting a canonical list, but I would consider them as little doors through which, if you're interested, you can knock on that door and be able to kind of find out more about a particular director or a particular group of directors that were significant at that time.
Mhm. Okay, so let's start with the very basics. Okay, f fourth, fifth, and sixth generation. Okay, these are not, how are these titles came to be? Because I just read that they are not just chronological, right? They have to do with a classroom or st something like that, right?
Yep. As a matter of fact, I would say that these categorizations are very controversial, um, or contested, to say the least. The generations, a lot of times, I think the first generations are usually referred to pioneering Chinese filmmakers. And then we are talking about the second generation of filmmakers, and then the third generations of filmmakers are usually roughly referring to filmmakers who were active, first of all, in the 1930s and 1940s, or basically that would be considered the second generation. And then the fourth generation, sorry, the third generation usually refers to filmmakers who actually worked during China's 17 years period, which is roughly from 1949 to 1966. So the third generation really refers to filmmakers who worked during the 17-year period, and meaning from 1949 to 1966, or some people would say from the establishment of the People's Republic of China until the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And during the Cultural Revolution, of course, there were filmmaking going on. There were film productions going on. As a matter of fact, there were more film making going on than a lot of people would have given credit to. But a lot of them, as you could imagine, were very kind of propaganda films, revolutionary opera films. So a lot of people were really kind of written that particular period off. The fourth generation really refers to a number of film students who actually went to the Beijing Film Academy before the Cultural Revolution, before 1966. And they graduated pretty much before the Cultural Revolution. But because of the Cultural Revolution, they were not able to work. And then they started to make films really by the beginning of the 1980s. And the Cultural Revolution ended in 1970. Some people would say 1976, but the kind of Deng Xiaoping period really started in 1978. And during the first kind of 4 years after the Cultural Revolution, um, and a third generation director, his name is Xie Jing, was pretty much being heralded as the representative filmmaker. So this group of fourth generation filmmakers didn't really come to work until like 1980 or 1981. And then the fifth generation, of course, referred to the first group of graduates from the Beijing Film Academy after the Cultural Revolution. But because of the time lapse with the Cultural Revolution, they actually worked pretty much simultaneously with fourth generation. And at first, a lot of fifth generation films were also not being available within mainland China because some of their films originally were considered a little bit challenging for the political authority at that time. And the sixth generation really referred to those filmmakers who graduated a little bit later on, like Jia Zhangke, Zhang Yuan, and also Wang Xiaoshuai. And so that particular generation really started to work independently, like basically from the studio system. They started to but a lot of them were highly interested in documentary filmmaking, or at least using the documentary filmmaking devices to in their fiction films. And so a lot of them also started to shoot on digital video and some newer formats in the 1990s. And so that particular generation really lasted. I would say some people even count the sixth generation as something that has been ongoing. But I would say that some people would say that around the 2000s and so, like with China joining the WTO, and also with a very different generation of filmmakers who were interested in a variety of different subjects. Um, a lot of filmmakers in the 2000s and 2010s wouldn't necessarily consider themselves as a generation. Like they began to just call themselves independent filmmakers or studio filmmakers for that matter.
So essentially, there is no seventh or eighth generation now, right?
No, a couple of labels did arise or were proposed by European and American scholars. Some people call I generation, some people call them different things. But in my mind, I always find that, well, instead of worrying so much about labeling these filmmakers, we should respect the fact that, frankly, a lot of them refuse to be labeled. As a matter of fact, I remember, yeah, so as a matter of fact, when I went to Beijing in 2015 and 2016, um, I and talked to a lot of independent filmmakers and also scholars. A lot of them really were inspired by the 2000s and 2010s independent filmmakers and began to rethink whether these labels are in fact that meaningful in the first place.
Hmm. Okay, okay. And tell me a bit, was there any time something like a new wave in China, like we have in other countries? Something like that? A new wave of cinema?
The new waves, you mean the new waves in
Like the one in Taiwan, let's say, was something like
Mm,
that in China?
absolutely. I really find that the new waves in Hong Kong and also in Taiwan were significant. I'm not saying that they were significant in literally pushing the movements themselves. The idea is that a lot of Chinese filmmakers in especially the fourth and fifth generation filmmakers, when they started to work, or even for the fifth generation of filmmakers when they were still in the Beijing Film Academy, they were already familiar with definitely Hong Kong new waves because the industry was exceptionally strong during that time. So you couldn't learn about the cinema at that time without at least knowing the basics of the Hong Kong new waves, like An Ho or like Alan Fong, like those works. But more importantly, I think fourth and fifth generations really, and also in some ways, even like the sixth generation filmmakers were really, really impressed by works by Hou Xiaoqian and Edward Yang. And I would say that even Jia Zhangke would constantly refer back to Hou Xiaoqian's work and Edward
Mm-hmm.
Yang's work.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Okay. And since the fourth generation happened during the Cultural Revolution, and right now I'm curious, how has censorship changed from then till now? Because things seem a bit weird now also. So what's your opinion on that?
We need to remember that ironically, I think the fourth generation and the sixth generation filmmakers were a little bit less affected by censorship. It's a very interesting kind of trajectory. I think Paul Clark, a very important film historian in Chinese cinema, pointed out really succinctly that in China, I think there has always been a movement, an ebb and flow between periods in which censorship could be really tight and then periods in which censorship could be a little bit more relaxed. So bear in mind that during the Cultural Revolution, of course, none of the fourth generation filmmakers could make any films. And even right after the Cultural Revolution, between 76 and 80, I would say that Xie Jing became such a prominent figure who rehabilitated himself from the Cultural Revolution and started to make these almost like apologetic films, like films that kind of being critical of the Cultural Revolution. Around that time, I think there were two issues. I think, first of all, some filmmakers and also film critics who were trained from the Beijing Film Academy wrote critically against the Xie style for two reasons. First of all, they really felt that the Xie style as a kind of film aesthetics was already out of touch with the newer generation. So that was their first criticism. The second criticism was that their feeling was that, okay, Xie Jing, of course, I mean, no one doubted Xie Jing's sincerity in terms of being apologetic about the Cultural Revolution. But at the same time, they really complained that a lot of Xie Jing's films, they kept talking about how victims of the Cultural Revolution survived, went back to their homeland and rebuilt their homeland. And for a lot of the newer generations of people, it's just like, well, none of these films really address the actual trauma of the Cultural Revolution or what young people had to face. Because we need to bear in mind that a lot of young people during the Cultural Revolution, they were born in the cities and then they would be forced to go to the countryside to work. And then it really took them another 10 years, meaning like until the end of the 1980s, that the kind of returning to the city was possible for some of these people. And the idea, so a lot of people complained, and then during the meantime, I think there was an influx of translated articles, translated works from European film theory and criticism, especially Andre Bazin in the Cahiers du Cinema works, and also some of the British and American criticism from the 70s and 80s. And so a lot of people were fascinated with not only the critical works themselves, but also the films that they discuss, Antonioni, and the French New Wave and Wim Wenders, a lot of these people became like topics of fascination, and films will also began to be available either in the cinemas or through VHS or things like that in the 1980s. And so I think there was a really sudden interest in using innovative filmmaking. One of the major figures, in fact, was Zhang Wanxing, and she was one of the few women filmmakers frankly, in the history of Chinese cinema. And she was an incredibly fascinating filmmaker who unfortunately died really young. And she wrote substantially in film criticism and the works she produced and she directed were really addressing the kind of traumatic experiences of the young people, not in relation, necessarily in relation to the Cultural Revolution, but in relation to the lived experience in the 1980s. And I also need to kind of mention that Wang Shuo, who was a very important novelist at that time, wrote a lot of literary works on the subject of young people who were unable to return to from the country to the city, who went to the city anyway as a kind of migrating, and so that was called the Liumang culture. Sometimes it's inappropriately being translated as kind of hooligan cultures. They sometimes committed crime, sometimes they were unemployed, and so you get a lot of sense of rebellion and dissatisfaction, frustration from the fourth generation. And so they were interestingly, relatively unaffected by the censorship system. They were able to produce whatever they wanted to produce. And the sixth generation, once again, were relatively unaffected because that was a very open period in which filmmakers were able to say whatever they wanted to say, be critical of the society, and be very, very open about what they didn't like to say. And again, especially with Zhao Zhangke's work and also Zhang Yuan's work, even Wang Xiaoshuai, the idea is that a younger generation who survived the Cultural Revolution, who returned to the towns and cities, but they were now facing China's transition into post-socialism, into capitalism in some ways. And and so the idea is that they felt abandoned by, on the one hand, by the socialist past, which promised them a lot of things, and they're losing the pension, they're losing their benefits, they're losing their guaranteed livelihood under socialism. And at the same time, I think they were adjusting in a very, sometimes in a very perverse way, to capitalism. And so these two generations are kind of kosher. But then the fifth generation, I think, was the only generation that caused a lot of problems from the authorities. And yeah, so should I pause at this moment?
Okay.
Yeah.
How about now though?
Mm. I think I think nowadays the thing is a combination between a few things. And then once again, I think in a very, very subtle manner, there were still ebbs and flows. A lot of people would notice that there were several waves of tightening censorship between the 2000s and today. I think some people would say that the tightening censorship really began as early as the WTO moment, even though in the 2000s we're still seeing a lot of exciting works, very critical works in Chinese documentaries and also Chinese independent films. And all the tightening moment really came around 2008 with the Beijing Olympics. And that particular tightening somehow was being done on a very local level, especially around Beijing. And basically at that time, I think we were already hearing a lot of worries about the Songzhuang, Chinese independent, the Beijing Independent Film Festival, and whether it would survive or not. And then I think a lot of people would say that the transition into the Xi Jinping era represented another wave of tightening, and in the around, I would say around 2015, 2016, we're already hearing a lot of, first of all, LGBTQI plus filmmakers worrying not only about whether the Beijing Queer Film Festival would survive, because queer and trans films a lot of times would be regarded by the government, both local and also national governments, not only as films or cinematic cultures, but also as a form of political activism. And and we began to hear a lot of things. I remember in 2016, when I was talking to two major producers and also curators at that time, Zhang Xianming, who curated the China Independent Film Festival in Nanjing, and also was the producer of a lot of Jia Zhengke's films and also Wang Xiaoshuai's films and documentary films as well. At that time, I think he was already thinking about strategies by which he could help independent filmmakers to get screening permits or also production permits. Had the basically, if the government were to implement tighter control by asking everyone to get production permits and screening permits legally, which happened a few years later with the China film law, which literally required that production would need production permit and also screenings would definitely need the Dragon Seal, which is the screening permit. Um, Another guy was Xie who actually established Radiance, and in some ways, I think the Xie model is really interesting because I think he really looked at it both as a strategy of dealing with an inevitable clampdown on independent filmmaking, and at the same time seeing it as a business opportunity. So on the one hand, I think so what he did, and in some ways Zhang Xianming was trying to do a very similar thing. The idea is that Xiemeng would use the more kind of American independent film model to kind of elevate Chinese independent films from being kind of like a independent, like taking a DV camera out kind of model to a kind of model that would involve serious production companies, packaging, financing. And so you would get a high budget to make these films. But then, at the same time, it lends legitimacy to these films, which are great because these films are now serious independent productions with financial backing. And so they could, the film companies, the production companies, and sales agents could actually ask for permits as a result, and they could be easily got done. But then at the same time, I think it does transfer some of the censorship, back of state censorship, to the level of a more kind of um, capital control. So in some ways, the idea is, which is typical of any kind of filmmaking anyway, the idea is that the private companies, in order to guarantee box office, you need to kind of observe some kind of self-restrictions and self-control in terms of what topics you can talk about. And some people would say that it's not really that different from independent filmmaking anywhere. And at the same time, in some ways, you can also see that as a form of shouldering some of the kind of self-censorship, if you want. And of course, the price of the rate, basically screening fee and things like that, also rose as a result of that, which on the one hand kind of made it harder, much harder for smaller film festivals around the world to screen these films and to promote these films. But at the same time, they were able to keep the circulation on kind of all the A-list and top film festivals around the world.
Mhm, mhm. So, excluding the diaspora films, do you have a rough estimate of how many movies China produces in a year nowadays?
Wow, I actually don't.
Because the numbers differ very much, significantly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I would say because the numbers that we are getting from any official channels, basically films that have already got production permits or screening permits or both. And I would say, but the idea is that we all know that within mainland China there is still filmmakers who has continued to make independent films without getting
Mm,
a production permit, and they are quite successful, thankfully. And then um, they don't necessarily screen them domestically, at least publicly in China. And Pingyao for a number of years was able to screen some of these films anyway, so they would get a little bit of exposure in a major film festival in China. But then they are aiming for an overseas audience, um, and so they don't necessarily need to worry about the Dragon Seal either.
mhm, mhm. Okay, okay. So this will come come across as a bit of cynic question, but
Hmm.
okay, from the Chinese independent movies we watch in the West, mostly through festivals, I guess, I find that there are two staples essentially. The movies either look like Jia films, or or there are family dramas that take place in rural areas about poor people. So I'm wondering, is that only that we see these films in the West, or is the industry like that to a large degree right now?
I would kind of disagree with you.
Please.
I would say there was a period of time in fact that there was a period of time in which it was a problem because I think yeah, I mean the 家政课 model was so powerful. So I would say that but I would say that in the 2000 and 2010s, I think we perceived that problem primarily because Jia Zhengke himself was also working with a lot of Chinese documentarians, and so that particular generation, especially with Wen Guang, who really advocated kind of cinema verite or kind of direct cinema style. Even though I think Wen Guang's style is very different from direct cinema in his acknowledgement of personal subjectivity and also like and negotiation between personal and collective subjectivities. Um, I would say that, and sometimes, Pano, I really agree with you. I think because when I was watching some films, when I was still doing the Chinese Visual Festival in London, and looking at some of the younger filmmakers' approach, yes, there were indeed filmmakers who were not necessarily as original as we hoped, and they were kind of just emulating 贾樟柯 motto. But I would say that there also came a slightly different. I think there were two different moments when I felt that things did. I would say even three different moments. One moment was that there was a beginning. I think in 2017 and 18, there were two moments. I think a lot of people began to observe that. First of all, there was the South South China New Wave, which is a label that was really coined simultaneously both in South China and also in a place like the International Film Festival Rotterdam. And I think the idea is that a lot of filmmakers at that time really moved from Beijing or even Nanjing to even more southern places. And of course, south of the Yangtze River. And so, like, Gu Xiaogang still works around the Hangzhou area. And then you also have other people like Diao Yinan and also a lot of people who work really in the south. Even Qiu Zhongzhong works a lot in the Sichuan area, which is still the southwest. So there is a movement from the north to the south, and which actually changed a lot of things. First of all, a lot of these people were already dealing with the newer generation who did not have any memories of the Cultural Revolution. And so they were no longer dealing with the kind of transition between socialism to post-socialism. They were actually just dealing with capitalism, like how it felt to grow up in a relatively wealthy family, a middle class family, sometimes even an upper middle class family, and then their concerns were a lot more about rebellion. The idea is that the parents got a lot of money during the reform and opening up period, and then they really felt like their parents were still in control of them through financial control, that kind of things. Sexuality, they were really experimenting with sexuality, frustration, and things like that. So it's already a very new kind of generation, and with kind of urban ennui. In some ways, it is that they feel like they got stuck in an urban area that was constantly being renewed. There was no root, no sense of root and identity. You can see that a lot in films like Bigan and again Diao Yinan and also like Gu Xiaogang's films. A lot of these films are really dealing with a lot of different kinds of sensibility. But also at the same time, you're also seeing a different kind of filmmaking style with instead of the kind of documentary style, you have a lot more controlled kind of camera work with, for example, one scene, one takes. Begon made some films with one scene, one takes. Um, um, like and also in terms of like high production value so that they can manipulate the camera in a very different way, non-linear non-linear narrative, and also sometimes puzzles, like using puzzles, memories, mixing memories in reality, that a lot of these techniques are very new. And some people who worked outside of South China, for example, in the more remote areas, or even the later Pamit's Haddon film show a this kind of different sensibility as well, like a little bit of magical realism. So a lot of these things were changing. And and then I would also say that when look at a film, basically films that really came out in the last couple of years, we're also seeing an even newer generation of filmmakers who are beginning to be basically, they are already talking about a very affluent society with cities that are already very, very capitalized and clean up, and with uh, like robots and actually AIs are no longer in the future, they're here and now. And so they're dealing with a kind of social reality and also lived experience that are very, very fresh and also very energetic and also very young, which is unimaginable. Like it is both a China that was unimaginable before COVID. It's also a newer Chinese generation that has a different sense of defiance against the larger social political structure that was unimaginable once again, even like a couple of years ago. So we are already seeing a very, very different type of filmmakers to an extent that I would say that like earlier this year when I was in Rotterdam, I really felt that it was the first time I really felt that Jia Zhengke is already an older generation of filmmaker.
Hmm. Okay. So, should we expect some films that take place in the cities and are with people that have a bit of money now, you think, in the future?
But it also brought about a different set of problems, right?
Uh,
It's like, for example, like women who explore their sexualities
hmm.
in with money or without money, but knowing that what they want is connected to money.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Mhm.
And let's talk a bit about queer cinema, because after watching East Palace, West Palace, I'm curious about how this has developed through the years, through the time of East Palace, West Palace, till now. What's your opinion on queer cinema, Chinese
I
one?
think queer cinema is very interesting. I think in the 1990s, of course, East Palace, West Palace, and also Farewell My Concubine were considered the most important bit of like examples of queer cinema. Retrospectively, I think a lot of filmmakers today, or the younger generation of queer and trans filmmakers today, and also the younger generation of film and trans scholars today, study scholars today, would argue that those two films are better understood as trans cinema than queer cinema.
Hmm. Hmm.
And because in terms of queer cinema, frankly, even at that time, I'm not saying that they were right or wrong. The idea is that there was something that hasn't really they were just scratching the surface, and very often, from a pretty cisgender heteronormative point of view of what queer life actually meant. At that time, to be honest, I think there were already queer and trans filmmakers who were already active. But I think it really the things began to really bubbled up um, in the 2000s with an even newer generation of filmmakers like Choi En, who graduated from the Beijing Film Academy and who later actually taught in the Beijing Film Academy, Fan Po, and Shi Tou, like a lot of people who either had a filmmaking education or were really picking up the cameras to work. And that was really heavily influenced by the first edition of the both the Beijing Independent Film Festival and also the Beijing Queer Film Festival. The first edition of the Beijing Queer Film Festival showed Stanley Kwan's Lan Yu. And I
Hmm.
think Stanley Kwan's Lan Yu on the one hand, it's a very mainstream, commercially viable film. It's a beautiful adaptation of the web novel Lan Yu, and of course, his Stanley Kwan's work is truly amazing. We often kind of underestimate how much it has inspired the both the queer and trans audience at that time, and also the queer and trans filmmakers at that time, in mainland China especially, what is possible if you put your mind into it and be courageous enough to actually make a film like that. And so, um, and I think a lot of filmmakers and audience members still remember that film fondly, and really refer back to that moment. Um, a lot of filmmakers, Korean and trans filmmakers in the 2000s into the early 2010s, including Fan Po and Cui Jian, really saw filmmaking not only as a cultural and also aesthetic exercise, but also as an act of political activism. And not necessarily in the way the Beijing Authority was thinking about at that time, but in a way that, for example, Cui Jian feels that, yes, I mean, Cui Jian really uses very experimental devices, defies all kinds of standards, aesthetic standards, and also and really try. I mean, he was trained in all of these things. He was trained to make a really good, like well-made film with like well-made drama, like that kind of thing. But he didn't do that. He actually used every opportunity to challenge what is a good camera position, what is a good camera movement, what does it mean by a good story. He defied all of these. And for him, I always remember that he says that if we are now sitting in person across the table, and if we're thinking about what can make changes, he says that look at this table. If you make a small change to the leg of the table, cut a little bit corner of the table, it sounds like a small thing. It sounds like it's insignificant. But by cutting a little corner of the table, you are already making a small change that is inevitable, that also is indelible. And at the same time, you're also encouraging other people or even yourselves to look at this table and how it functions a little bit differently. And so I think his filmmaking is really about that. And Fan Po Po loves making documentaries. His early works are a little bit more straightforward, but are extremely important to document the kind of queer and trans movement at that time. And then later on, I think in the 2010s, I would say in the later 2010s, we're also beginning to see trans cinema with a higher exposure. And I think around 2017, 18, and 19, there was a kind of surge of trans cinema, like right before COVID, with the RIP. And in Hong Kong, there was Tracy, which also made an impact in mainland China, and Ho's small film that was actually released in China on on the trans character. One can say that all of these trans films were made primarily by cisgender directors. But I think a film like The Rip, I would say that yes, a lot needs to be done further by trans filmmakers and trans characters. But I think the RIP did a really good job in some ways, at least by engaging trans actors and also trans activists in the making of the film, in the construction of the story, and inviting them to be actors in front of the camera. And so in some ways, it's a really interesting way to do a kind of co-production between the cis and trans communities to at least get the dialogue going.
Hmm. And I guess last question, since we have to do some other work after this. Tell me, are there any names of directors and maybe even actors that we should look out for from Chinese mainland cinema?
Yep. So there are many great names that we need to pay attention to. The first person I would say, of course, we need to keep paying attention to the South China New Wave people, including, for example, Bigan, was always looking for the next one, Gao Ming, and also definitely Gu Xiaogang, who has made two wonderful films already in the Hangzhou area. Zheng Xinyuan is a really huge name that I would say. She's one of the few women filmmakers who is still actively making a lot of really challenging films outside of the system, and at the same time a queer filmmaker who's really daring in terms of like challenging questions of sexuality and modes of storytelling. Um, Chiu Jong is still a really serious, again, he's working outside the system and he's super active. And he's both an excellent documentarian and also independent fiction filmmaker as well. Yeah, I'm just saying a few names here, and and I have to say that every year, just like yourself, like Pano, when we go to film festivals around the world, and a lot of times we sometimes feel like, oh, I don't know if the Chinese independent filmmaking scene is still going, and we often surprise ourselves with new names and really young filmmakers who are in their 20s and 30s, and you see a lot of promising voices. And I must say, a lot of promising voices from women filmmakers, and it's a really important point to make.
Mhm, mhm. Well, I guess that's it. Thank you very much for your time, Victor.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Pano. Yeah.
Okay, great, great.